Real freedom is not a slogan here. It is what shocked a train car full of Hungarian prisoners of war the morning they rolled into a dusty American town, and the guards announced something unbelievable. You can walk the streets this afternoon. No bars, no cages. Stay in pairs, be back by sundown, and do not cause trouble. That single sentence shattered everything they thought they knew about captivity and about the enemy who held their fate. Janos Farkas pressed his palm to the hot glass and squinted at a row of storefronts that looked as if a child had drawn America from memory. Barber poles spinning lazily. Hardware store window stacked with gleaming shovels. A diner with a neon coffee cup that seemed to be pouring steam into the sky. After weeks behind fences, the ordinary quiet of Main Street felt more unreal than a battlefield. Next to him, a radio operator named Baylor muttered a prayer in a voice rough with disbelief. In their minds, the rules of war were fixed like iron. Prisoners stayed penned. Guards stood watch with rifles across chests. Outside was for the free. Inside was for the defeated. Yet a sergeant with a creased smile and sunburned nose had just said they could go outside into town like regular men. The bus jerked to a stop beside a whitewashed fence. The gate swung inward. The camp itself was plain and practical. Long wooden barracks. A chapel made from 2 joined huts and a painted cross. A baseball field that was more dust than grass, with a backstop wired together from scrap. What caught Janos was not the fences, but how lightly they lay on everything. The towers were there, yes, but the soldiers in them looked bored. A few waved at the new arrivals, as if greeting summer workers rather than prisoners in enemy uniforms. Orientation came quick. Work crews for the beat fields, road repair detail for the county, a sawmill team leaving before dawn. Rations that were not luxurious but generous compared to the watery stews of their final weeks under German command before capture. Then the sergeant returned to the thing no one could stop thinking about. We have an arrangement with town. If you prove decent, you can visit in groups on designated days. Wear the armband so folks know you are prisoners. Spend your chits if you want a postcard or a slice of pie. Be courteous, and you will be treated with courtesy. Cause a scene, and the privilege vanishes for everyone. They expected a test or a trick. They expected to be marched in tight formation with bayonets at their spines. Instead, at 2 p.m, after roll call and a lecture about staying clear of the rail yard, the gate opened again, and a dozen Hungarians stepped into the heat with one guard walking behind at a casual distance. The town was close enough to smell fried onions and motor oil. Janos felt air move differently beyond the fence, wider and less supervised, and it made his chest ache. He had not noticed how small he had become until the open street tried to stretch him back to human size. On the corner, a boy tossed a scuffed baseball against a brick wall and caught it barehanded with the calm of someone who has done that all summer. He stared openly at the men with PW bands and then shrugged and went on playing. An old woman in a blue dress paused with a grocery sack on her hip and said good afternoon as if she meant it. 2 men in coveralls debated something about irrigation panels, nodding once at the prisoners and continuing without spitting at their boots or crossing the street. Nothing about it made sense if you had learned to expect humiliation from enemies. Everything about it made sense if you belonged here, and that was the shock. Baylor stood rooted before the diner window. Inside, the cook cracked eggs with one hand and flirted with the waitress who swatted him with a damp towel and laughed. The laughter rang through glass like a bell, and the men outside rocked on their heels, swayed by sound alone. A nearby notice board listed harvest wages for anyone willing to pick from first light to sundown. Janos read the chalk scrawl twice. The figures were not fortunes. They were something else more dangerous to hopeless men. A chart that said work is worth this much, and your hands could earn it. The guard cleared his throat. You can step inside if you like. Pay with the chits. Keep your voices low. The bell over the diner door jingled, and 40 eyes tracked the prisoners as they slid into a booth. The waitress arrived in a breeze of coffee and sugar. What can I get you, boys? It took Janos a second to realize she was speaking to them. Boys, not prisoners. He wanted to be cautious. He wanted to ask what they were allowed to order, how much time they had, whether anyone would be angry if they laughed. Instead, he heard himself say, "Pie and coffee, please," and she smiled as if he had passed a test he did not remember studying for. The first bite of cherry pie burned his tongue and melted him anyway. He had eaten under shelling. He had eaten in ditches. He had eaten rations so grey they could have been a winter sky. He had never eaten anything that tasted like a decision a person made in peace. Around him, his comrades breathed deeper with each ordinary clink of forks and cups, as if air were thicker here. He understood then that permission to roam meant more than a walk. It meant the Americans believed there was a world beyond war and that even prisoners could touch it without breaking it. When they stepped back into sunlight, the second shock waited. A shopkeeper in a pinstripe vest had set a wooden table on the sidewalk with a handwritten sign that said postcards and stationery. He spoke slowly for their benefit and held up different scenes printed in color: a river under a red bridge, a courthouse with white pillars, a night sky above wheat stubble and silos. He was not selling to them because he had to. He was selling because commerce is how small towns ask the future to visit and stay a while. Janos bought a card of the bridge, though he had no safe address for it. He wanted to own proof that a place could be tidy and harmless in broad daylight. Work began the next morning. They rose to a whistle and climbed onto flatbeds with canvas roofs, the road humming beneath. The beet fields lay in long green stripes that promised backache and simple math, row by row, hour by hour. A foreman named Calloway showed them how to top beets clean and fast with a single practiced twist. He did not shout. He did not jab with a stick. He corrected hand angles and praised speed. He said, "You keep the tops out of the crates because the sugar factory will dock me, and then I will dock you, and that is a chain none of us want." The logic held. They fell into rhythm that made sense because every step had a why. By noon, a breeze moved across the flats and carried the noise of a church bell from town. Baylor wiped his face with a bandana and grinned. Freedom a man can taste is a day when the reason for the work is clear and a bell tells you time. In the afternoon, a county truck pulled up with a barrel of water and 2 crates of peaches the color of late summer. The driver, a woman with sun freckles, said the farmer down the road had extras. She left them without ceremony. The peaches were so ripe they dented at thumb pressure. Janos ate too, and spent the next hour thinking in circles about how the taste of a peach could convince a man he was not a number, but a person who had survived for more than duty. Evenings changed them fastest. After supper, they were permitted to stand by the fence and talk to locals who strolled past, curious or friendly or both. Some asked questions that pried gently. Where is home? What did you do before the war? Do you like American music? Others offered small favors. A book of poems with the pages dog-eared, a harmonica with one cracked reed that still made a sweet sound if you tilted it right. When the town team practiced on the dusty diamond, the guard waved the Hungarians over and handed them gloves that smelled of leather and old rain. The rules were simple enough, but the feeling was stranger than new food. Running in a borrowed glove in a borrowed game on a borrowed field and hearing someone shout your name as if it belonged here. Not everything was easy. One afternoon a veteran limped by with his sleeve pinned and stared at the PW bands until the air felt like a wire. He did not speak. He did not need to. Suffering serves its own language. That night, the sergeant reminded them that courtesy was not decoration, but a bridge that could carry weight only if both sides respected it. They nodded and meant it. They had learned in a single week what the camp had hoped to teach in a month. Trust is a ration that increases when carefully shared. The rumor began during a lunch break under the sliver of shade beside the irrigation ditch. Next week, the harvest festival would go on as usual. The town would hang bunting and set up a bandstand in the square. The prisoners would be allowed to attend in work clothes with the PW bands visible. No one believed it. Then, the foreman confirmed it in his practical voice. You help bring in the beats. You deserve to hear the music. Keep to yourselves if you like. Dance if someone asks you. Do not forget who you are and where you sleep. Janos tried to picture a dance where enemies might laugh at the same joke. He could not imagine it, and then he did, and once imagined it, refused to leave. At dusk, he walked the perimeter with Bela and told him the thing that had been growing since the first slice of pie. If freedom is not a flag or a shout, but a set of choices available to ordinary people, then today we tasted it. Not ours to keep yet, but near enough to smell the sugar on it. Bela nodded and looked toward the town where the neon coffee cup lit the window like a small red moon. He said sometimes the shortest distance between two sides of a war is a street where people know your name. Tweak ideas for virality inside this chunk. Consider trimming the first sentence to land harder in 10 seconds by swapping it to real freedom is not a slogan here. It is what shocked a train car full of Hungarian prisoners when guards told them you can walk the streets. After the pie scene, add a one-sentence curiosity beat hinting at a coming conflict, such as a stare from a wounded veteran that will later escalate at the festival. Before the Harvest Festival reveal, insert a question to the viewer asking what they would do if given one afternoon of freedom in enemy country to pull comments. The day of the Harvest Festival came wrapped in the shimmer of late September heat. From the barracks window, Janos watched banners bloom across the town square like flags from some gentler campaign, stripes of red, white and blue that fluttered over stalls selling candied apples and kettle corn. The guards moved differently this morning, less as sentries and more as organizers. Even the dogs seemed to understand that this day carried no scent of threat. By noon, the prisoners had finished their morning quota of beet hauling, washed at the pump, and changed into their cleanest work shirts. The armbands remained, white cloth stamped PW in black, but the air hummed with possibility. The truck that took them to town felt like a ferry crossing between worlds. Inside, the men were quiet. Outside, children chased each other through dust plumes rising behind wagon wheels. As they rolled onto Main Street, the crowd shifted. Heads turned. Conversations dipped. Then, almost shyly, the music from the bandstand started again. Brass horns rising like a polite handshake extended to everyone present. A man from the hardware store tipped his hat as the prisoners passed. A group of teenage girls whispered and giggled behind cupped hands. Sergeant Harper, the same guard whose drawl had first announced their roaming privilege, climbed onto the truck bed and spoke over the noise. You know the rules. Enjoy the day. No alcohol, no wandering past the square. If you're unsure of something, ask a guard or a local. They know the score. Then he added, quieter but meant to be heard, you earn this. Make it count. Janos stepped down first. The ground felt oddly springy under his boots, as if the earth itself wanted him to remember it was not a prison yard. The smell of roasted corn and tobacco mingled with the sweet bite of sawdust underfoot. He and Bela wandered past a booth where a teenage boy demonstrated a yo-yo trick, then stopped near a pen of prize hogs. A farmer noticed their armbands and grinned. "Fine work on the beat hall," he said. "Heard you boys got it done 2 days early." "Town appreciates it." Janos could only nod, words choked behind a sudden lump in his throat. In his old world, the enemy never thanked you unless it was to mock. Here, gratitude sounded like rain on dry ground. At the music stand, the county band launched into "You Are My Sunshine." A dozen couples danced in a whirl of plaid skirts and laughter. Bela nudged Janos. "Imagine explaining this to the colonel back home," he murmured. "Dancing with the enemy and no one shoots." They laughed, and for a moment the laughter belonged to no nation at all. The fragile balance held until the fourth song, when the wounded veteran appeared again, the man with the pinned sleeve, the one whose eyes had cut through them days earlier. He stood by the lemonade stall, jaw tight, watching the dancers. The music faltered under his stare. Janos felt the crowd tilt toward discomfort. Then the veteran did something no one expected. He walked straight to the bandstand, climbed 2 steps, and said something to the fiddler. The tune changed. It became slower, mournful, something older than any flag. "Home on the range." He turned toward the prisoners. "You know this?" he called. Janos hesitated, then raised his voice softly to match. "We learned it last week," he said. The veteran nodded once. "Then sing it with us." The invitation rippled through the square like wind through wheat. The guards exchanged glances, but made no move to interfere. Janos began to sing, his Hungarian accent stretching the vowels oddly, but not unpleasantly. Others joined. The veteran sang too, one hand pressed to the empty space of his sleeve. When the song ended, applause erupted, not polite but genuine, as if the music had loosened something heavy inside everyone there. Afterward, the veteran walked over. Up close he looked older, lined by pain and sun. "You fought for the wrong side," he said quietly, "but so did I once or twice, depending who you ask. Just don't waste the peace when it finds you." Then he shook Janos's hand. The crowd, seeing that, seemed to breathe easier, and the festival carried on. As evening blared across the sky, lanterns lit the square in amber circles. The Hungarians were offered slices of watermelon, their hands sticky and bright under the fading light. A small girl with pigtails tugged at Bela's sleeve and asked, "Are you really prisoners?" When he nodded, she frowned. "You don't look mean." He smiled. "Maybe we forgot how." She thought about that for a long moment before giving him the paper flower she'd been holding. The truck ride back to camp was silent, except for the rattle of empty crates. Harper sat facing them, boots braced against the side rail. "Town says y'all behaved better than most locals do after payday," he said, half grinning. "That means more trust next month. Keep it up, and maybe you'll get Saturday passes." That night, Janos couldn't sleep. He sat on his bunk, staring at the postcard of the red bridge pinned above his bed. The day had folded something inside him into a new shape, part hope, part ache. Freedom, he realized, was not a gate opening. It was a gate that stopped mattering because people stopped believing it defined them. Weeks turned into months. The beet harvest ended, replaced by lumber work in the nearby hills. Snow dusted the fields, then melted, leaving rivers of mud and thaw. The Hungarian prisoners became familiar figures around town. They patched roofs, repaired roads, hauled lumber, and shared coffee with shopkeepers on cold mornings. One Sunday, a preacher invited them to attend service. The chapel was crowded, air heavy with hymns. The sermon spoke of reconciliation, of how faith means trusting that tomorrow might not look like yesterday. Afterward, townspeople lined up to shake the prisoners' hands. The veteran with the pinned sleeve was there too. He clapped Janos on the shoulder and said, "Didn't think I'd see the day, but you're part of this place now." By spring 1946, the camp gates were open more often than closed. Most guards had been reassigned. Locals came to the compound to hire workers directly. Some prisoners were offered permanent contracts. One morning, Harper read a list of names approved for release under the early repatriation program. Janos's name was among them. He packed what little he owned: the postcard, the harmonica, a clean shirt folded twice. But when the truck arrived to take them to the rail depot, he hesitated. Harper noticed. "Something wrong?" "I thought I'd feel different," Janos said. "Free." Harper chewed the inside of his cheek. "Maybe you already are. Freedom's not a train ticket, son. It's the part of you nobody can fence." The ride to the depot was quiet. At the platform, townspeople had gathered to wave them off. The veterans saluted. The preacher handed each man a small paper Bible. The waitress from the diner pressed an apple pie into Baylor's hands. "For the road," she said. When the whistle blew, Janos turned for one last look at the town. The neon coffee cup still glowed faintly even in daylight. He realized that in every direction fences existed only where fear demanded them, and fear, like wire, rusted fast when exposed to kindness. Tweak spots for virality, tighten the first paragraph to open with visual immediacy, start with banners blooming over the town square before mentioning harvest. Add a tension beat mid-festival by extending the veteran's approach one line earlier for suspense. Insert a viewer prompt after the handshake moment. Would you have trusted the men who once wore the enemy's uniform? For comment engagement. At the train farewell, heighten emotional closure by lingering on the pie handoff, a symbol of peace baked by ordinary hands. The years after repatriation blurred into the slow rhythm of peacetime Europe. Janos returned to a Hungary that no longer resembled the one he had left. The war had erased towns, reordered borders, and replaced familiar hierarchies with slogans that promised equality but delivered suspicion. He found his mother's house half collapsed, the orchard stripped bare, and neighbors whispering about new political committees that decided who deserved bread and who deserved silence. Freedom here was a word people pronounced carefully, as if it might vanish if spoken too loudly. For months, Janos tried to rebuild what remained. He worked in the rail yard under Soviet supervision, his days governed by whistles harsher than any guard's shout. At night he dreamed of open roads and the sound of baseballs cracking in dusty air. Letters to Baylor went unanswered until one winter morning a thin envelope arrived from America. Inside, a photograph showed Baylor standing in front of a barn painted with the words Westfield Farm, Kansas. On the back he had written in careful English, "I stayed." They offered work. "The air here still smells like freedom." Janos stared at the photo for a long time. It was the first color he had seen that year, not filtered through gray snow or propaganda posters. Beneath the uniform layers of ideology, something old stirred, the memory of a place where guards trusted prisoners to walk among townsfolk, where strangers had treated him not as a threat, but as a man capable of choice. He folded the photo into his coat pocket and carried it everywhere. By 1948, pressure from the new regime grew unbearable. Former POWs were viewed with suspicion, accused of harboring Western sympathies. A local officer hinted that continued loyalty might require cooperation, informing on friends, reporting unpatriotic talk. That night, Janos made a decision as irreversible as any battlefield order. He sold his last family heirloom, a silver watch, and used the money to bribe his way onto a freight train heading toward Austria. The escape was not cinematic. It was cold, hungry, and half-blind through forests patrolled by men with dogs. But after days of walking, he reached the American zone near Salzburg, where refugee camps bustled with displaced souls. Among them were whispers of sponsors from across the ocean, farmers needing laborers, factories seeking steady hands. Janos filled out every form they offered, and when an interviewer asked what skills he had, he smiled faintly. "I can harvest beets," he said, "and I know how to fix fences." Months passed before a telegram arrived. Placement approved. Westfield, Kansas. Crossing the Atlantic felt less like travel and more like stepping back into a paused memory. When the ship docked in New York, the skyline burned silver against morning fog. He thought of the first time he had seen America through a prison truck window and marveled that life had looped him here again, this time by choice. The train west took 3 days. Each mile peeled away the noise of the war until the horizon returned, flat, endless, forgiving. Bela met him at the station, older now, hair receding but eyes bright. They embraced like men who had survived 2 lifetimes. "Welcome home," Bela said simply, and the word home landed softer than Janos expected, as if it had been waiting for permission to belong to a new place. The farm stood just outside town, fields of wheat stretching toward the sun, windmills creaking in rhythm with cicadas. Work began before dawn and ended with the kind of exhaustion that cleans the mind. Janos shoveled grain, repaired irrigation lines, learned the seasons of American soil. At night, he and Bela sat on the porch listening to radio baseball broadcasts, marveling that men could compete for glory with bats instead of rifles. Over time, the locals grew accustomed to the Hungarian accents that flavored their English. Children from neighboring farms called them the Beets Brothers, a nickname they wore proudly. They attended church, barbecues, and eventually citizenship classes. When Janos stood before the county judge in 1955 to take the oath, he thought of the veterans' words from that festival. "Don't waste the peace when it finds you." He didn't. Within a few years, he leased his own acreage, a modest plot beside a river bend where the soil was dark and generous. He married a widowed schoolteacher named Clara, who found his foreign politeness charming and his quiet humor steadying. Together they raised 2 children who spoke English with flat Midwestern vowels and only fragments of Hungarian lullabies. Still, the memory of that first American town never left him. In the evenings, he told his children about the guards who let prisoners roam free, about the diner waitress who had served him pie without fear, about the wounded soldier who had made peace with a handshake and a song. "Were you scared?" his daughter once asked. "Of course," he said, "but freedom is often disguised as fear at first. You only recognize it afterward when you realize no one was holding you back but yourself." In 1960, a local newspaper ran a feature titled "From Prisoner to Planter," the Kansas farmer who chose freedom twice. The reporter expected tales of hardship, but found instead a man content with the ordinary miracles of rain and harvest. "America," Janos told her, "taught me that the opposite of captivity isn't escape. It's trust." He kept a box under his bed filled with relics from that other life: the harmonica, the Bible from the preacher, and the postcard of the Red Bridge. On its back, in fading pencil, he had written a single line years earlier: "Freedom tasted like cherry pie." By the time his children left for college, he had become part of the local fabric, president of the co-op board, deacon at church, the man who still spoke softly about how kindness could end wars faster than any treaty. When he died in 1984, the town named a small bridge after him, painted red to match the one on that postcard. And every autumn, during the Harvest Festival, the band still plays "Home on the Range." Some say you can hear an unfamiliar accent singing along softly from nowhere and everywhere at once, keeping time with the memory of a promise once given to a stranger. Make it count. Tweak ideas for virality. Sharpen the moment of return to Hungary by opening with a single image, János standing before his mother's half-collapsed house, holding silence heavier than rubble. Add a brief suspense beat before the escape to Austria, maybe a near miss with border patrol, to heighten tension. At the oath-taking scene, insert a short viewer prompt like, "Could you trade your homeland for a new one if it meant true freedom?" to spark engagement. The summer of 1965 baked Kansas into a gold so bright it hurt to look at. János stood beside his son Peter, now 17, as combines rumbled across the wheat fields in mechanical procession. Dust rose behind them like a parade for the living. The boy worked shirtless, bronzed by the same sun that had once blistered his father in a Texas camp 2 decades earlier. The rhythm of harvest was familiar now, a sound that pulsed through the family calendar the way church bells marked faith. That evening, they drove into town for the annual county fair. As always, music drifted from the bandstand, rides spun children into squeals, and the air thickened with roasted corn and engine grease. János walked slower these days, his gait careful but steady, the fairground lights reflected in his glasses, a constellation of man-made stars. Near the livestock pens stood a new historical exhibit, a small tent draped in flags. A handwritten sign read, "Local Heroes of the War Years." Inside were photographs of farm families, ration books, letters from soldiers. But one display made János freeze. In the center hung a yellowed clipping from 1944, Hungarian POWs assist harvest, help town meet quota. Below it, a photo showed a group of young men in patched uniforms standing beside American farmers. The caption read simply, "Camp Riley Labor Detail." He stared, tracing faces blurred by time until he found his own. It was him, unmistakably, a ghost, 20 years younger, holding a shovel and squinting against sunlight. For a long moment, sound faded, the fairground noise, the laughter, even Peter calling for him outside. He felt again the weight of that day, the first time he realized an enemy could hand him a tool instead of a weapon and call it cooperation. A volunteer noticed him lingering. "You know one of them fellas?" she asked kindly. "Yes," János said. "All of them." Later, back at the truck, Peter asked what he'd seen. János told him about Camp Riley, about the guards who trusted prisoners to walk among townsfolk, about the pie that changed everything. Peter listened, eyes wide. "You mean you were a prisoner and they just let you go into town?" "They let us earn their trust," János corrected. "That's rarer and harder." The next week, the county newspaper ran a short piece about the rediscovered photograph. A reporter came to the farm, curious to meet the man in the old clipping. János obliged, though he insisted the story wasn't about him. "It's about what people do when they stop being afraid," he said. "Those guards had no reason to trust us. The town had no reason to welcome us, but they did. And that changed the world for a handful of men who carried that lesson everywhere we went." The article spread quietly, copied by a regional magazine under the headline, "Real Freedom," the day enemy prisoners became neighbors. Letters arrived from across the Midwest, veterans, immigrants, students, each confessing how hard it was to believe such mercy had been possible in wartime. János answered everyone with the same sentence. It happened because someone decided it should. That fall, an invitation came from Texas. The Historical Society of the same small town where Camp Riley had once stood planned a reunion to mark the 20th anniversary of the camp's closure. They had tracked down surviving guards, townsfolk, and former prisoners who'd stayed in the United States. "We'd be honored if you came," the letter read. People still talk about the day the POWs sang in the square. Janos hesitated. He hadn't returned to Texas since those captive months, partly out of superstition, partly because Kansas already felt like the home he'd chosen twice. But something in the invitation tugged at him. Clara noticed him rereading it at breakfast. "You should go," she said. "Take Peter. Let him see where it began." They arrived by train that November, the landscape flattening into the same broad horizons that had first taught Janos how large silence could be. The camp itself was gone, replaced by a grain depot, but the town remained almost unchanged. The diner, the hardware store, even the red neon coffee cup glowing faintly above Main Street. At the town hall, a modest crowd gathered, old men with medals, women whose hair had turned silver, a few middle-aged Texans who claimed to remember the prisoners helping at harvest time. On stage, a local teacher recited names from yellowed rosters, then introduced the guests. When Janos's turn came, he stepped forward slowly. Applause rippled through the room. He began softly, his accent still textured by Europe, but shaped now by decades of prairie wind. "When I was brought here, I believed captivity meant fences and freedom meant gates without guards. But I learned something else. Freedom is the space people give each other to be human." He paused, scanning the faces. "You gave us that, and we carried it with us into every life we built after." Someone in the audience called out, "Sing it again!" Laughter followed, then murmurs of agreement. The band struck the opening notes of "Home on the Range." Janos smiled, lifted his chin, and began to sing. The hall joined in, voices old and young, rough and bright, blending until the song became a kind of prayer for decency remembered. After the reunion, he and Peter walked the edge of the old depot, where rusted fence posts still jutted from the ground. The wind smelled of mesquite and diesel. Peter broke the silence. "Do you ever miss it?" The camp, the men. "Miss it? No," Janos said, "but I carry it." Freedom isn't what you escape from. It's what you keep alive after the gates open. They watched a freight train thunder by, each car bearing the logo of a company that shipped grain across a continent once divided by war. Janos thought of Bela in Kansas, of Greta Schneider in Texas, names that had scattered, but stories that had converged on the same truth. Captivity ends where understanding begins. Back home weeks later, a package arrived from the Texas Historical Society. Inside was a framed photograph from the reunion, a copy of the 1944 picture beside one taken in 1965. Two versions of the same men, 20 years apart. Between them, a small plaque read, "Real freedom lives where trust begins." Janos hung it above his desk, just below the postcard of the Red Bridge. Every morning after chores, he would sit with coffee and glance between the two images, feeling the invisible thread that tied them together. Virality tweaked suggestions. Open this chunk with a vivid cinematic image. Janos and his son, framed by wheat as bright as molten gold, to pull viewers instantly. Before the historical exhibit reveal, add a 5-second slow build with sensory tension. The smell of canvas and old paper filled his nose before he saw the photograph to heighten emotion. At the reunion speech, cut in a quick reflection prompt, "Would you forgive the guards who once held you if they had also handed you freedom?" The last winter of Janos's life came soft and merciful, the snow thin enough to see the wheat beneath it, breathing in rows of pale green. He was 73 now, his hands stiff but steady as he walked the edge of his field at dawn. The horizon endless and silver, reminded him of every road he had ever taken towards something better. Peter had taken over the farm, efficient and confident, while his daughter Anna taught history at the same county school where her mother once taught reading. Between them, they carried everything he had once thought he'd lost: continuity, belonging, peace earned through sweat instead of war. Inside the farmhouse, the walls told his story better than any biography. Photographs of children in graduation gowns, newspaper clippings from that reunion, a brass harmonica polished smooth from decades of fingers. Above the fireplace, framed side by side, hung the postcard of the Red Bridge and the photograph of the 1944 and 1965 gatherings. Beneath them, Clara had placed a small plaque she'd commissioned from a local carpenter. It read, "Freedom, once shared, multiplies." That morning he brewed coffee, sat by the window, and wrote his final letter, addressed to the town museum in Texas. He thanked them for keeping the memory alive, enclosed a small check for their new exhibit, and wrote in neat script, "Please hang this where young. People will see it and know that fences can hold safety as well as fear. The difference is the heart behind them." He sealed it, placed it beside his Bible, and watched the light creep across the floorboards. Later that day, Peter came in from the barn and found his father sitting peacefully in the chair, the coffee cup half full and still warm. The postcard rested on his lap. He looked as if he had simply paused to rest after a long day's work, which, in a way he had, 70 years of it, ploughing a single idea across 2 continents, that real freedom is not permission to do whatever one wants, but the choice to treat others as if they already belong. The funeral drew the whole county. Farmers stood beside teachers, veterans beside immigrants, everyone holding their hats as the pastor spoke over the open grave. He believed freedom could be taught like any trade, the pastor said. He proved it by how he lived, patiently, steadily, and without bitterness. As the coffin was lowered, the town band played "Home on the Range," the same song that had bridged enemies 21 years before. Voices cracked in the cold air, but the melody carried clear across the fields. In the months that followed, letters poured in from people who had read the story of the Hungarian prisoner turned American farmer. One came from a young historian at the Texas State Museum. "We're naming a section of our new World War II exhibit after your father. It will be called Real Freedom. It's about what happens when compassion wins the argument." Years later, Peter visited the exhibit with his own children. Inside a glass case lay the original postcard, its corners worn, the handwriting faint but legible. Freedom tasted like cherry pie. The curator told them how visitors often stopped at that note longer than at any of the medals or maps. "Maybe," she said, "because it's proof that history isn't just about battles, it's about what people do after the fighting stops." Outside the museum, the sky was a brilliant Texas blue, the same color his father had once watched through barbed wire. Peter took a slow breath and smiled. "He'd like this," he said. His daughter looked up. "What part?" "All of it," he answered. "The idea that strangers can meet as enemies and part as family." And under that vast, forgiving sky, the legacy of one Hungarian prisoner turned American farmer continued quietly, told at county fairs, taught in classrooms, whispered around campfires by people who believed kindness could still rewrite the hardest stories. If you were moved by Janos's journey, from prisoner to farmer, from enemy to neighbor, share this story. Let it travel beyond these words, across timelines and borders. Somewhere, someone still needs to hear that real freedom begins the moment we trust each other enough to live without fear. Comment where you're reading from and tell us, what does freedom mean to you?